Hi, I'm Jack Moon, and my special guest today is none other than the legendary Max Merritt.
So I went to the barber by the candy store. I got my turn.
Hey, Western Union man, send a telegram to my baby. Send a telegram, send a telegram. Come on, man, send it on to my baby. Never will possess while she sits there waiting. All they gotta do is try a little tenderness. Whoa, you're slipping away from me. Whoa, you're slipping away from me. And it's breaking me in two.
Hey Max, it's Jack Moon. How you doing?
Well, hey, I'm breathing and I'm feeling good, and things can't get much better than that.
Max, you could have been a bricklayer, but chose a career in music. Any regrets?
Oh, of course not. I've had the greatest life I could possibly wish for, but I had to admit that I really loved bricklaying as well. I enjoyed that. It was creating something and building something, and my father always said to me, "You spend more time looking at what you've built than you do building." Once I got my foot into music, I there was no stopping me. I really had my set on the horizon, and it was wherever it took me from then.
Now, you formed the Meteors in 1956. What inspired the name?
Bill Haley and the Comets. They were the first rock and roll band I saw. I saw Bill Haley and the Comets, and I was listening to Little Richard at the time. But with Bill Haley and the Comets, that gave me the whole band idea. As it turned out, I tried to change the name later on down the line when I was living in England, and it never worked. I mean, we tried all sorts of different names and released records under different labels and whatever in Germany and that, and nothing happened. And we had to keep on coming back to Max Merritt and The Meteors all the time. Otherwise, I was nobody.
You're born in Christchurch in New Zealand, so you're a Kiwi, and of course, as we do to all good Kiwi artists, we pinched them over here in Australia. Your mother set up those first gigs for you, is that right, at the Christchurch Teenagers Club?
At that time was a guy called Rolly Jeffries, and he sort of started me getting interested in sort of doing music, and he had an idea about a teenage club, which I took to my parents. And we had a friend called Trevor King who owned the local theatre. We used him to organize the whole thing, and we started up the Teenage Club with my dad on the door collecting the money, and my mum in the kitchen making scones and serving tea.
I believe you're pulling in around 700 people or so, or even more during those early gigs.
That's right. Yeah, we did. It was a great vibe. Everybody enjoyed themselves. It was on a Sunday afternoon from 2:00 till 6, and so we started up the club, and it worked out immensely well. And it was still going a long time even after I left Christchurch.
How influential were those rhythm and blues records you borrowed from American servicemen?
Oh, immensely.
I would imagine that in New Zealand at the time, those records probably wouldn't have been even played on the radio.
Oh, they weren't. No, none of the things that the guys brought me down from their jukebox was ever released in Australia or New Zealand. These were really obscure times.
It was promoter Harry M. Miller that booked those first New Zealand tours. You were supporting Johnny O'Keefe.
And it just turned out, unfortunately for Johnny, that I kind of stole the show. I'm not being big-headed now. It's just the way it was. The guy said, "Oh, you did good last night." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Haven't you seen the morning paper?" And I said, "Why? What's in it?" And he said, "Local boy steal show." And that was the last thing I heard of it until I went in that night and walked into the theater, and Johnny said to me, "You know that song you started off with last night?" And I said, "Yeah, One Night by Elvis." And he said, "Yeah, that's a great song." I said, "Oh, thank you, Mr. O'Keefe." And he said, "Well, tonight I'm doing it." I said, "You can't do that." And he said, "I just did."
Was Get a Haircut your first single, and how did that come about?
Yes, it was. A guy called Dick Letitia, and he wrote the lyrics, and I put the music to it, and I got the record deal, and we recorded that.
Ray Columbus and the Invaders were fellow Kiwis, but in some ways they were your nemesis.
Yeah, you're right. We were always in competition. They were a great band, and Ray had this real thing about me. You know, I was always, as you say, his nemesis, and he was forever battling us. For some reason or other, it was strange though, because they were the ones that really got the first really big hit out of the two of us, and he used to lord it over me quite a bit. But
was it around 1963 you decided to try your luck on Australian soil and found the scene dominated by one Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs and Ray Columbus, I believe? How did that trip work out?
It was an exciting time because we're all young and full of piss and vinegar, and we loved doing what we were doing. All of those guys did. Ray's band, our band did, and sort of represent New Zealand in a good light as far as Australia was concerned. The thing with Viking was we became the house band there, and we ended up backing Dinah Lee, Tommy Adderley, Howard Morrison Quartet, but this was kind of before the Beatles came into being, and bands in those days weren't seen in a great light. We were only viewed as being backing bands, and it wasn't until the Beatles came along that bands came to the forefront and became somewhat of a personality in themselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It was your friend Jimmy Sloggett who turned you onto Otis Redding, and I believe a particular song, Try a Little Tenderness. Is it fair to say that event set the course for that gritty R&B style that you're best known for?
And Jimmy said, "Mate, you got to come down and have a listen to this record." And he played me Otis's record of Try a Little Tenderness, and it blew my socks off. And when I got back to Sydney, nobody had the record, see. It wasn't even released in Australia. And I got in touch with Ray Brown of Ray Brown and the Whispers, and Ray had the only copy, and I borrowed it, and I learnt the song, and we did it, and the rest is history. All that stuff wasn't released by the record labels in those days. They didn't release Motown. They didn't release Stax. You know, none of those great labels were released in Australia or New Zealand in those days. I mean, we heard everything secondhand.
Late 1960s, you regrouped a New Meteors with Bob Birtles, John Harrison, and Stewie Spear, and you hit the road. How did punters take to the new lineup?
I did a cruise around the islands, which went from Sydney to Fiji to Auckland and then back to Sydney. And I lost all my band on that cruise. I went down one night to the Whiskey A Go-Go, and across the room, there was Yuck Harrison. So I walked across and I said, "You want a job?" He said, "Yeah, great." And I was looking for a drummer. I said to Bob Birtles, "Any ideas who we can get for a drummer?" And he said, "How about Stewie?" And I said, "Do you think he's the right image?" How wrong could I be? He became the image, you know. That worked out to be a magical, combination. From the first time we played together, it was just magic.
You, Bob, John, and Stewie, the new lineup, were involved in a very serious head-on car accident, and despite those serious injuries, you all survived. And the musicians and fans rallied around the band. Were you and the band surprised at that level of support?
Yeah, we really were. I mean, it was a devastating thing for us because Stewie had his legs broken in so many places. The nurses called it scrambled legs, and they were broken, and they put them to get back together, of course. But one leg was shorter than the other, so he had to use a build-up shoe for the rest of his life, and he was virtually crippled for the rest of his life. I lost an eye in the accident, and Bob Birtles had his kneecap shoved halfway up his leg, and it was quite devastating. Strangely enough, Yuck, who was laying in the back of the van at the time, came out unscathed. He was like a dog in the back of the van, recovering from a hangover, and he came out with nothing.
So tell me about Max's place.
Well, that was on the corner of Toorak Road and Punt Road. We just used to run a dance there on a Saturday night and get all sorts of local bands, all the top bands around, and there'd be maybe 5 or 6 bands a night. And I used to host it. I'd be at the door, welcome people in, and up on the stage comparing, and it was a great little venue. The 1960s in Melbourne were fantastic. There was more gigs in Melbourne in those days than I think anywhere else in the world.
In 1969, I believe you covered the Jerry Butler song "Hey Western Union Man," and along with your self-titled album, both the 45 and the album hit the top of the national charts. How did that feel?
As I said, it was an exciting time. We were at the top of our game. I had a great band. Throughout my career, I've had wonderful players with me. I went from one group of fantastic players to another group of fantastic players, which was Yuck Harrison, Bob Birtles, Stewie Spear, and it took my career in a totally different direction. So we got into the soul thing, which I felt totally at home in, and it made it so much easier for me to do. It just made me look good.